This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you, Lori. It just goes to show some people are easily amused. I thought she was going to have you break out into song with happy birthday. Yeah. And not only should you see me wiggle my ears, you will. So let's see, there's the right one. I don't know if you can tell. And the left one over here. Two together are easy. And the reason that I'm doing this is because when I was a kid, my father, who was a career Marine, could wiggle his ears, and he sometimes would do this. And I was impressed, of course, and he would tell me, well, Michael, only smart people can wiggle their ears. So, of course, I had to do this, and I still remember to this day standing in the bathroom on a chair, staring into the mirror, and trying to will my ears to move, and not being able to do it. And after some frustrating days, suddenly, they began to move. So I kept at this, strengthening it. I haven't done it in a long time, so you might not have been as noticeable as once was. But so I got this going, and sure enough, I got to go to my dad and say, well, you say only smart people can wiggle their ears, but tell me, can you do one at a time? And he said, no. And I said, well, only the truly brilliant. And I just use this as an example because I think in many realms, our brain is capable of many things that can help us, not just entertain. And it's a matter of our figuring out how it's done. Another example that comes to mind, there is a condition called acquired savant, which someone might have an accident, and suddenly they are able to do things that they were not able to do before. Presumably, the brain's attempt to compensate for something, like an artist who was in an accident and sustained a brain injury, and after this accident, he lost his color perception. He could only see things in black and white. But the resolution he had on seeing things went sky high. He could read license plates at hundreds of yards. He could see small things that even if you compute the density of the rods and cones lining our retina, he should not have been able to discern because they were so small. And he did this by subconsciously, his eyes would scan to fill in the spaces in between. And no one knows why he suddenly was able to do this, but presumably he didn't acquire any new equipment for getting that done. So all of us seemingly have that capability, and maybe it just isn't manifest because we don't need it to be. But that is a backdrop of just thinking about our brain and how that affects our behavior and what we do. I would like to talk about how maybe we can regulate some of the things in our body with an eye toward wellness by affecting the somatic sensory system. So just the senses, we can, maybe you could call it, fool the brain into doing some things that would be beneficial. And as I have on the bottom, soon to be Professor Emeritus, I did make the decision to leave academia and join IHMC for not just a new adventure, but it is a very high-quality institution, and I really appreciate seeing so many people coming out and supporting them, and I'm glad they do this to do something to support the community, but I do think that it is an organization that is a real gem. So our outline, we'll talk a little bit about the mind-body connection, and the brain, I hope to convince you, is a special part of us, but maybe not all of us. Framework for intentionally affecting physiology by way of the natural senses, as I said. Hopefully to head off our use of pharmaceuticals, drugs, and hopefully motivate all of this with an example of what we're doing in the sleep realm by taking advantage of sensory inputs to get better sleep. So the bottom line, we can develop technologies as non-invasive therapies accomplished via natural sensory stimulation. So with this mind-body connection, the brain, as I say, is a very important piece of this. Now here's a cartoon rendering of a neuron in the human brain. The human brain turns out to be 3 pounds of very remarkable matter. I brought my extra one that I usually reserve for those times. Maybe I'm taking a quiz. And a typical adult brain consists of almost 100 billion neurons. And I'll just pause for a minute to think about 100 billion of anything. It's a very large number. But the true power of the brain and its computation isn't just in the sheer number of cells that do the computing, but it's the interconnects between them that seem to hold a key to our thoughts, desires, and it is estimated possibly could be upwards of a quadrillion, 1,000 trillion interconnects in our brains. So that in itself is pretty mind-boggling. Signals in our brain travel upwards of 250 miles an hour, which sounds pretty fast. One thing I will say right now, though, that the brain gives us a perception of reality. One thing that keeps me up at night sometimes when I'm lying in bed in a dark room, I realize that my brain basically is an organ floating in a very dark, warm cavity, and all it has to create my perception of everything around me are those senses that come in primarily through the spinal cord. Vision goes straight in from our eyes, but it takes these chemical, electrical impulses and reconstitutes our perception of the world, which, again, if you dwell on that, can be disturbing, potentially. And as I think about the brain, it does dawn on me that it is very complex, seemingly far too much for me to understand. But then I realize if the brain were simple enough for me to understand, I would be too simple to understand it. So there's something else to dwell on. So that is the brain. And as I think about the brain, which in and of itself is an interesting statement, I wonder who is in control, right? I sometimes think that I am my brain or I am my body, but there are lots of examples that let us know that that's maybe not the case. And I think of something as simple as respiration, for example. Can you just decide to stop breathing? No, maybe for a short time, right? And if you try to hold your breath like the little kid who says, oh, I'm just going to hold my breath if I don't get my way, don't worry. Because they will breathe, even if they intend not to, because, as we would say it, their body won't let them. And just the way we talk about this interaction is kind of interesting, but one that appeals to me as a mechanical engineer, and that is somehow I am controlling this machine that you see before you as my body. Now, it gets a little tenuous when I start to think about what is the interface between Michael Larson and Michael Larson's body, and I do know that if you lop my arm off, and please don't, but by way of illustration, I think you would still, if you knew me, say, well, that's still Michael. But as I start chipping away at my brain, suddenly I might not be someone you recognize as Michael anymore. So the brain does hold a special place in order for us to focus our attention on. So I actually took some people and did MRIs of their brain to see if I could discover just how it is that the person controls the brain. And if you really zoom in, what you find is that, there's a center of the brain that we can't find. Much of what we know about this sort of thing we owe to Phineas Gage. No doubt many of you back in psychology classes, undergraduates, took a course where you talked about Phineas Gage, who back in the 1840s was a foreman on building the cross-country railway. And his crew was actually setting explosives with these large iron bars in order to break rock open. And one of them didn't fire with the explosive as it should, so Phineas went over to check it out, and sure enough, when he bent over, it ignited, and the bar went in his cheek and exited the top of his head. And so this is kind of a cartoon showing the part of the brain that was taken out by this rod that went clear through. And as I write, miraculously, Gage survived the injury. And in fact, he sat up almost immediately and began talking to his men. They put him on a cart, took him miles to the nearest doctor. He walked upstairs under his own power and may have made a quick recovery had it not been for the fact that the doctor, who was incredulous over the story he heard, stuck one finger in the bottom and another finger in the top until he touched and said, "I believe you." And he introduced bacteria that almost killed Mr. Gage, but he did recover, except he seemed to be a completely different person. Before the accident, he was well known in his community as being a rather upstanding individual, a person of ethics, and after he was pretty much a shyster, he ran off and joined the circus and just seemed to be a completely different person altogether. And it was this that got us thinking corporately about the fact that there are regions of the brain responsible for different things, and sure enough, much of Mr. Gage's personality rested with the part of the brain that got taken out, but not centers of the brain regarding language. So he was able to speak and had most of his memory still intact. So thank you, Mr. Gage. Now, most of you have probably heard that a company called Neuralink, owned predominantly by Elon Musk. But it is just one of about 20 companies right now that are pushing the boundary between this interface between the brain and science. And they have their first patient already wearing an implant in an FDA-approved clinical trial where over 1,000 small electrodes are put into the fissures of the cortex in a region underneath this button. And the person does have this big old button sticking up there, so it's not like it's under the skin or anything. But the idea is that we're going to be registering signals in people's brains to understand more about the activity that goes along with various things, with a hope one day that we can help people whose brains aren't doing what we think is normal for whatever reason, and we can supplement the brain firings with electrical impulses. So it is a brave new world, and initially my reaction is to think about ways that, of course, this could potentially be abused, but it's human nature that if something can be done, it will be done, and hopefully we can use it responsibly and ethically in the future, and we'll see. So in the meantime, I threw this here just as kind of a sidelight, yes, and I didn't bring a video, of which there are some. But there was a period of time where people with brain disorders were treated with lobotomies. And the person who actually perfected the technique was awarded a Nobel Prize. And this was a horrendous procedure that was used on people to destroy their frontal lobe of their brain. So I just mention it because although modern medicine is a marvel and helps us in so many ways, we do need to remember that it is still more art than science even today, and we need to make sure that we are thinking critically about all sorts of procedures that are being done on people. But it was just barbaric, and I won't get into an explanation because already the picture was enough. I should have moved on a little faster. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a model of the brain, and I recall I was telling you about the speed of signals in the brain. It is interesting to me that if I were to come out there and tap your toe just 2 times very quickly, boom, boom, you'd be able to discern those 2 different taps. Even if they're about 200ths of a second apart, you can discern that. And it turns out that at the speed at which signals go through our nerves, it takes about that long for a signal to get from your toe to your brain, much less if I touch your nose. The signal only has to go this far, so it's almost instantaneous. But if you can, and you can try this at home, not now please, but touch your nose using your big toe, the two signals should get to your brain about a 50th of a second apart, enough time for you to discern tap, tap, but you can't help but to only feel one touch because your brain, that's always taking in information from all your senses, isn't actually delivering to, dare I say, you, the actual raw data, but something that is a model of what we think perception should be. And because you know that you're touching your toe to your nose, of course you only feel one touch, because why wouldn't you? You're touching two parts of your body together that you know are happening at the same time, so try as you might, you can only feel one tap. And again, an interesting thing that every time you're looking at an optical illusion, that might just seem baffling and funny, but this is a consequence of looking at something that doesn't fit the model that your brain has of what you should be seeing. So instead of seeing what's actually there, you are perceiving what you expect. And it says a lot about just our nature in all kinds of areas, that we see what we want to see usually. So as we're having discourse, maybe even political, be careful not to only see what you think you should see and want to see. So here's our brain, and let's call that our self. Here's my body. I think I need to get to the gym a little more. And then I have the environment, or the outside world. So we've got this brain sitting in that dark cavity that's nice and warm. And how is it that we're going to effectuate that perception of reality? I made a little flow chart here so we can keep track. But the first thing we get is information about our world that comes via our senses. And if I ask most of you, what are your senses? You'd give me the 5 traditional ones of sight, touch, hearing, taste, and smell. This goes back to the days of the ancient Greek philosophers. Today, we have actually discovered there are quite a few more senses. There's some disagreement about how many, but certainly more than, say, 20. They include other things like a sense that we have of where our body is located. You don't have to see your hands to have a sense for where they are in relation to your core. Another one is a sense of balance that combines lots of things in our inner ear that we don't fall over. And all of these senses then are feeding in information to our brain, and that's all that we get. And again, our brain doesn't actually see anything. What our brain gets is electrochemical signals coming from the nerves lining the back of our eyeballs, and it reconstitutes this sense of depth, which is especially amazing given the fact that that retina is just a 2-dimensional screen onto which an image is projected. We get this perception. So all of this stuff is going into this computation engine we call the brain, such that we can get information and a perception about the world. So we get that perception, and that contributes to our state of mind. Maybe we're happy or angry or sad or surprised. And so we then seek to affect changes in our bodies to correspond to those. And right before this, I was talking to someone who was telling me about if a tiger enters the room, suddenly you find just the image of the tiger, and the thought of what the tiger could do will change your respiration rate, will change your pulse, how you feel, just from the perception. The tiger doesn't have to do anything to you in order to instigate those changes. So this state of mind leads to things like our breathing can change to a point, our heart rate, and our body temperature are all well-known consequences of how the perceptions are affected because of our brain's perception. One that we're just learning about that I think is actually very exciting, and that is the notion that our brain can directly affect the immune system. Now, traditional mainstream medicine says basically, okay, your brain can get in the act when it comes to medicine as far as a placebo effect might be concerned, right? Where if you believe that pain goes away, well, then pain can go away and your brain can have some domain over that. But not your immune system, right? The immune system is kind of an independent system, such that if you get a cut, bacteria enters, you get signaling cells that cause killer T cells to go to the site and begin gobbling up things, and then carrying it off to your thymus. And all of that happens kind of on its own from the signaling. But actually, some very exciting research in a number of different areas has suggested that our brains actually can enlist our immune system to get into the act even without the signaling. The one that I think maybe is most intriguing to think about, akin to a placebo effect mixed with a little Pavlovian behavioral conditioning, is some cancers are treated with drugs that will initiate an immune response that we hope attacks the cancer. The cancer is so wily, it kind of hides from our immune signaling system, but we can get it going by ingesting poison, for example, and that could have beneficial overall effects by turning on our immune system. But if you give someone a pill that instigates that system from starting, and then suddenly replace that with a sugar pill or a placebo, for some people, their immune system will continue to get activated by the sugar pill because they've been conditioned by taking the poison. And if they believe that this is happening, then their brain apparently can directly have this effect. So I like it for the implications we have, because wouldn't it be great, instead of just wiggling our ears, we could learn how to fight off the common cold or whatever that might be. So we'll see. So then after we affect a change in ourselves, we want to affect a change in the environment. And it wasn't until I made this chart for you that it actually dawned on me that the only way we ever affect our change in the environment is with our musculoskeletal system. You know, we have no other ways, unless maybe if we find out there's something to psychic energy, perhaps. But the most obvious way that we can effectuate a change in the environment is by moving it, touching it, moving ourselves, but all of that done with muscles supported by our skeletal system. So that, you know, I usually kind of put those things on the pecking order below, you know, my brain. But we would be helpless, literally, without a working musculoskeletal system, and it's very much part of our humanity, which I think is appropriate for IHMC to be looking at because of all the robotics work that they're doing. And then it's a feedback loop. When we affect a change in our environment, it changes what our senses perceive. We get a new state of mind. Hopefully, we ran away from the tiger and we no longer feel anxious about it being there. And with our musculoskeletal system, it did remind me of this Far Side comic of the boneless chicken ranch. In case you wondered where we got that boneless chicken from. So while we're cautiously working toward a better understanding of our brains and not running after Neuralink implants, I think there is much that we can investigate to intentionally structure the signals coming through our natural sensory channels in order to get those changes that we want, maybe even one of these days an immune response to help people fight off disease by just creating the right sort of inputs to our brain. Successes have been documented in inducing physiological responses, and I think they come basically in two flavors. One is confounding sensory inputs, where we use multiple sensory channels to make the brain think one thing that isn't real. And then there's Pavlovian conditioning, and just some examples that maybe we know about. Peppers that taste very hot actually stimulate the pressure sensors in our tongue. So it's actually a pressure sensor mixed with our knowing that this is a pepper, gives us that burning sensation. But even though, it feels hot, we don't call the fire department or anything. We know it's not a real fire. So our brain is a little confused, and that intense flavor we get is in part because of that confusion. Some of you may have seen famous examples of someone who is seated and a rubber hand and arm are put in place of their own arm that's behind their back. And then a researcher will begin to rub the hand. The person will actually have a perception of a feeling in their hand. And then suddenly the researcher will hit the hand with a hammer, which universally causes people to recoil in pain because their brain becomes convinced that this is their hand that is being injured rather than just some rubber thing, even though they know full well, whoever they are, I don't even know how to talk about it anymore. I've confused myself. They know that this isn't part of their real body, but they have that reaction. One thing, those of you who maybe do a little working out, lifting weights, if you're like me, sometimes you just feel like, I just can't do this today. But then maybe someone important walks into the room. Suddenly, you find the ability to push that bench press up one more time because of the effect it might have. It's well known, maybe you have seen, the Paris Olympics are coming up in just a couple of months. Is anybody missing this? This seems to be the worst marketing year for the Olympics ever. But maybe you want to tune into the track and field events, because what you often see are athletes, elite athletes, who know how to push their body to the limit, and you'll see them heading toward the finish line, giving it all they've got. And when the first place finisher breaks the tape, I don't use tape anymore. It's more dramatic, though. Breaks the tape. And you think, to a person, they should just collapse on the ground, right? They gave it all they got. But the elation of winning prompts them to throw their arms above their head and run a victory lap. Where does the reserve come from? And who gets to decide who is using the reserve? And in a sense, much like respiration, you might want to give it all you've got, but your body doesn't let you because it knows that it needs a reserve to make sure that you aren't going to kill it. You know what I mean, right? And so there is this interplay going on between our intentions and such. And I was talking to Diane, right? Diane, right before we talked, and she brought up the subject of free will. And I guess she was hoping I could answer that age-old question. Can we have an original thought? If you look back to the period of the Enlightenment, much as usually happens, people in culture, society latch on to scientific concepts and decide to use them in whatever way they need to justify their behavior. Those in the business world remember paradigm shift was a huge thing. Everybody wanted to have a paradigm shift. Actually, it was a consequence of studying the history of science, and paradigm shifts are things that nobody ever welcomed. They were a change in our basic understanding, changing a model. They were earth-shaking things that were usually accompanied with a lot of fudge data because it didn't fit the expectation. So certainly there was something wrong with gathering that one. But the business world thought it sounded kind of sexy, so let's use a paradigm shift, and suddenly everybody was having paradigm shifts right and left as an intentional activity, and it's just different. And the same thing happened with Isaac Newton. kind of talking about physics in a way that was more prescriptive than had come along before, and basically showing that things happen because of cause and effect events. And the apple falls from the tree, I feel it hit my head because of cause and effect. And so, of course, now you could easily imagine that if we knew the chemical state of our bodies completely at any point in time, we could predict everything, right? Going on in the future. All of the thoughts you're having are nothing more than the natural consequence of the sensory input your brain is getting, and you have no choice but to think what you're thinking, and it's all cause and effect. So the nice thing about that is, there is no free will, but it means whatever I'm doing, I can't really be held responsible for it, right? Because, I was just sitting here and suddenly these thoughts came. And to some extent, you can see why that seemed reasonable, because right now, don't think of an elephant. There's no elephant here. Don't think of one, but you're thinking of an elephant because to some extent, you or your body is subject to those sensory inputs. But what about original thoughts and responsibility? And I think we have a collective understanding that people, if they have a certain level of capacity, should be held responsible. Our prisons are full of those people, and we can't just assume they're automatons acting things out. Where does that come from? I think most of us feel like we have had an original thought. You heard I'm a game inventor. I invented Ket the Laser game. Anybody ever play that? No? Yeah, to me it wasn't much fun. I have a patent on the game. Somebody infringed on it. It was a 13-and-a-half-year trek through the legal system that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I will tell you that if you have a patent infringement case and you're the plaintiff, you don't want to go to the Supreme Court. But that's for another lecture where I get very angry. But for tonight, what about original thoughts? And maybe this is going out on a limb, and if this sounds hokey, well, I'll just move right along. But I do like that modern physics, quantum mechanics in particular, opens the door for basic uncertainty being at the heart of everything that we do and all of physics and all of existence, and there are certain statistical distributions that govern the behavior of things, but not dictating the behavior of things. And so if you think at a subatomic level, maybe that's where we are interacting for real with these physical things we call bodies, in which case now things like vibrations and brain waves maybe become more important when we think about perceptions between us and that interface. So there's something else for you to think about when you're lying in bed and the room is dark. So there is an opportunity to have science bolster the notion of free will. So Diane, there you go. Psychoneuroimmunology, that's the name given to this idea of kind of the interface between immunology and psychology for having our brain maybe affecting our immune response. Expectation can control our response with those models. If we force our brain to have a model of getting well, then all we have to do is align the proper input perception in order to achieve that. Can you read this slide? No, because I just wanted you to see that there actually are lots of examples of somatic sensory regulation that affects things, and it's sometimes as simple as music causing us to calm down. And there are lots of behavioral conditioning things that are associated with neural stimulus that I think could work in conjunction with that. So for my application, it is sleep. And how long am I allowed to talk for? Did somebody say as long as you want? That's right. I only hear what I want to hear. Right? In fact, you heard I'm a professor, right? So sometimes when I begin to lecture, I take my watch off and I put it down on the podium so I can keep track of time. But I overheard two students sitting in the front one day, and one of them said to the other, "What does it mean when Dr. Larson takes off his watch like that?" And the other one said, "Absolutely nothing." So buckle up. Well, let's look to sleep as maybe an application of this, and you'll find out why sleep is near and dear to my heart, not just because I try to do it sometimes, but if you think of a stool of a healthful life, there should be 3 legs. Most of us, however, only really pay attention to 2. Some of us only pay attention to 1. But nutrition, you have to eat right? You need the proper fuel, you need the right nutrients in order to take advantage of the fuel. And exercise, we want to keep these machines humming along nicely, lots of known benefits to exercise. But what about the missing stool for many of us, and that is sleep? And here's just the question, if you've got a big deadline, you've got something important you have to do, something needs your attention, which one of these do you sacrifice first? Sleep. How many say sleep? Yes, it's the audience participation. It's well known that most of us sacrifice sleep first, to the point that it is kind of a badge of honor if you go without sleep, right? Nobody brags, I ate a whole chocolate cake, but I went without sleeping. Personally, I think that the reason for this might have something to do with the fact that anybody here enjoy eating? Yeah, don't leave me up here all by myself. Yes, because when you're eating good food, you get that immediate visceral response, right? It tastes good. When you're exercising, although you might not want to, you can feel a little virtuous, right, about doing this thing that you know is good for you, and maybe some endorphins get released, and you actually do have a good feeling for a biological reason, and you feel that you are exercising your muscles. Sleep, on the other hand, is something that you don't experience the benefit of until you're awake. So the antithesis of sleep is when you feel the benefit of having slept, not while you're sleeping. So fundamentally, it's kind of different to have your body associate the benefits with the activity for that reason. And I will encourage you to intentionally try to get sufficient sleep. The more I have learned about sleep and continue to learn about sleep, it has so many benefits for us. And some say, hey, I'll sleep when I'm dead, right? Well, you might get there a little faster, so be careful. But of course, we do want our lives to count for something, so I'm not advocating sleeping all the time, as good as that might sound. So why do we sleep? And this was a mystery for a long, long time. Because you can think, well, my brain needs to rest or my body needs to rest. Well, why can't I just sit in a comfy chair, maybe dim the lights and just sit quietly for a little while? Why isn't that enough? It's clearly not enough. About 8 or 10 years ago, time flies when you're having fun, researchers discovered something that has been dubbed our glymphatic system. And you may have heard of this now. It's beginning, the word's getting out. That when we are in deep sleep, and only when we're in deep sleep, your brain literally shrinks in your skull. It gets smaller. And the reason seems to be that the majority of our body has a lymphatic system whose job, it's a bunch of vessels that carry away the byproduct of cellular activity in order to keep our bodies clean and healthy. Well, in our brains, the real estate is too valuable than to have a lot of these lymphatic vessels. So the brain has a different way of cleaning out all of those twisted proteins and the byproduct of activity by using the natural channels that open up around primarily blood vessels when the brain shrinks a little bit. And so around all those blood vessels, of which there are many, because your brain uses at any point in time about 20% of all your body's use of energy is going to your brain for just thinking, or in some cases not thinking. But I'm not mentioning names, so mine would be there. So the brain shrinks, and when I say a little bit, some claim to have measured the shrinkage as much as 20% of the total volume. So we're talking about a big deal, potentially. And it's only happening during deep sleep when someone is like dead to the world and they're completely out, and you have a hard time rousing them. But if we go without that phase of sleep, we miss out on this cleaning. And although the story isn't exactly what we were led to believe, again, not just the medical community, but basic research can be tainted by the various incentive structures that cause people to do things. But you may remember a couple of years ago, there was a big flap in the news about Alzheimer's research having been fudged back in 2006 that kind of set the course for thinking that beta amyloid buildup is the main driver for Alzheimer's, which it is still heavily implicated, but we now know that it's not a simple kind of one source. There are people who suffer from Alzheimer's without having a long time buildup, but many people who do have this buildup of these plaques in the brain that deep sleep can be washing out. Because another thing that we've learned is these dementias, like Alzheimer, and there are many, don't just come on you when you reach a certain age. They actually build up over decades of life. And the biggest correlator for someone's likelihood of getting dementia, other than a genetic predisposition, the strongest indicator is how much deep sleep someone is getting. So it really is something that we should be paying attention to. And apparently, that's the reason that we sleep at all. If you think about an evolutionary biology sort of argument, why do you want to be there unconscious, ready to be jumped on by some animal? There must be an important reason, and it seems to be this brain cleaning reason. And this is just a picture from the original paper that identified this, where some subjects, animals, were injected with a radioactive dye into the cerebral spinal fluid that sits around the brain. And during deep sleep, as you can see on the left, this perfusion of that actually happens through the brain when you're in deep sleep, and that shrinkage occurs. And it has been replicated many times. So we have a problem when it comes to sleep. CDC calls it a public health epidemic. Over 70 million people in the US alone clearly are not getting enough sleep. Lots of prescriptions for sleep meds. I couldn't find any reliable data since 2014. Maybe it's gone down, but a lot of people are taking sleep meds. 63 billion annually in lost worker productivity from lack of sufficient sleep. Over 10% of Americans 45 and older use prescription meds regularly. And then 1 in 3 Americans over 65 take something to aid with sleep all the time. And this is especially bad because there are national guidelines that say people over 65 should not take sleep medications, particularly benzodiazepines, because of the other negative effects. But people just say, well, I have to sleep, and this is the only thing that can help me. So it is a real problem. It used to be that it was thought that older people just needed less sleep. We now know that that's a fallacy. It's just older people have a hard time staying asleep. And there are lots of consequences to getting older. That unfortunately is one of them. So by the numbers, just to try to get you thinking, wow, I didn't know that. 6,000 fatal car crashes each year caused by sleepy drivers. So much like drinking, if for no other reason, try to be alert and awake for the other people in your life. 1 in 3 adults claim to be sleepy regularly during the day. I can relate to that. 71,000 injuries per year by driving sleepy. These last two are kind of disturbing. 20% of pilots admit to some serious mistake due to sleepiness. Recently, I saw in the news there was a case. There were two pilots in front of an airplane, both fast asleep at the same time. 1 in 20 first-year medical students make serious mistakes due to sleepiness. I'm sure we could have a third talk about the way we select and train and treat our physicians in this country. It's a messed up process. All I can figure from looking at it from the outside is like hazing, right? They did it to me. I'm going to do it to them. But it's not the best way. And I do thank everyone who has dedicated their life to caring for others. I think we should help them. Sleep deprivation, American Airlines Flight 1420, the Challenger accident, the Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island are all linked to people getting sleepy. Exxon Valdez, they'll say, oh yeah, the pilot had a drinking problem, but if you actually look at the transcripts, he was sleepy. He wasn't getting enough sleep and was left in charge of the ship. And some people just look at sleep as a symptom of caffeine deficiency, and it isn't the case. The way you know you aren't getting enough sleep is if you feel drowsy at a time you should be awake. And I know from looking at you all right now that some of you are not getting enough sleep because I have nothing to do with the drowsiness you're feeling. My ego won't allow that. So if you feel drowsy, that means you have a sleep debt. Maybe you've heard this term. Sleep debt, it's an analogy to your money in the bank or your checking account, your ledger. Imagine you're the U.S. government and you have a giant sleep debt. The thing about sleep debt is you can only pay so much of it back. And if you have a short-term sleep debt, say you pull an all-nighter for that final exam or that report you have to write, you can sleep a little extra that weekend and make up for it in a short run. But over the longer run, we're talking over days, suddenly that sleep debt is manifest into those long-term damage that will be done, that you don't want done. And for those who still think of the badge of honor of going without sleep, looking at a couple of sports figures, LeBron James, Roger Federer, both of them during their respective sports seasons are open about striving to get 12 hours of sleep per night because they know that they can only perform at their peak if they're getting sufficient sleep, and 12 hours is what they both shoot for. And LeBron James is now trying desperately to keep his team in the NBA Finals and is still a sports figure. Roger Federer is now fabulously wealthy from making lightweight sneakers. I only mention it because I'm insanely jealous. We could have done that. There are two things we know for sure about sleep. It is still very much a mystery in many regards. But we know it's sleep or die. We infer this. We've never done any experiments of keeping some human awake until they perished. There are like some ethical considerations. I don't know. But some people have actually tried to stay awake. Fortunately, their bodies won't let them take it to that extreme. But with mice and other rodents, it's well known that if you put them on a little platform and they have to keep moving, otherwise they fall in the water and will drown, they keep moving, eventually they literally just expire from lack of sleep. And if you do an autopsy on their bodies, you find that you can't see anything wrong with them. They literally just die from not sleeping, which is kind of interesting. So it's not like you have this wave of things going wrong in your body. It's just a lack of sleep. The other thing that we know for sure is that as you get into deeper sleep states, your brain slows down. We know this in part because by definition, we call low, slow brainwave rates sleep. Medically, that's how we define sleep. But it is the case that over and over when we look at people sleeping, we see, if you measure the voltage between places on your head just with a multimeter, you could do this. If you had a multimeter that can measure microvolts that most can't, and you have the ability to filter that signal to get rid of all of the much larger microvolt signals that are flashing around, we can tease out the activity due to the neurons firing underneath. And what we see, first of all, is that when our 86 billion neurons are firing, they're not doing it at random. It's not like, hey, I got a piece of information, all right, I'll pass it along, and now I've got another one, I'll pass it along. The way it works is, oh, I've got some information, I'm going to hold on to it until I'm nudged by the neuron next to me, and then I'll pass it along with whatever signal I'm getting, and we integrate these together, and as they get passed along, somehow that process of transferring sensory stimulus into an original thought or an action gets produced by this accumulative wave effect that sweeps over our cortex. And here are just a list of what happens in sleep. And I'm just going to close with, because I guess you all were just too engaging. My interest in sleep stems from my daughter. Please don't judge me for my, messy thing here. I have a daughter that suffers from narcolepsy, and I was able to create something that applies the principles of all of this, and I thought I would get a lot further than I did, but at least you can appreciate that most of the things I work on
is at the very
are
heart
firsthand.
of what it means to be human, and we are most in touch with our humanity when we are creating. My middle child, Jessica, she was a very high achiever, first chair flautist in the local youth symphony, played the piano beautifully, all A's in school. All of that suddenly changed when it became clear that her sleep during the day was getting uncontrollable for her. I'm Dr. Michael Larson, and I'm a professor by day and an inventor by day and night. And my daughter has narcolepsy. When my daughter finally got a diagnosis of narcolepsy, I had never heard of the disease before, so I began to learn all I could about sleep and how to help people get better sleep. Jessica does deal with excessive daytime sleepiness from the body's lack of regulating sleep cycles properly. She also has cataplexy, which is a sudden loss of muscle tone, hence typically someone will crumple to the ground.
I was exhausted, not sleeping well. For a while, I didn't know if I was going to be able to go to college the way I had planned originally. There were just a lot of things that I had kind of started to wonder if I needed to give up on.
It becomes very hard for someone to advocate for themselves. There are many, many people suffering from narcolepsy. Many of those people are not getting any help. So I took it upon myself to turn to technology to see if we can't develop a solution that would work naturally with someone's body instead of altering the biochemistry. I earned my PhD from MIT in mechanical engineering and really had my eyes opened to the idea that if solutions don't already exist, then go ahead and create one. People have been using what we call binaural tones for a long time. 2,000 years ago, Tibetan monks were using singing bowls, which have a very interesting effect on the brain in a natural way, to encourage meditation and calming effect. I have optimized that for sleep using actual brainwave measurements in real time to adjust these tones in a customized way. I have invented a comfortable headband that people wear while they're sleeping, and it has some built-in speakers that play binaural tones, designed both to help people go to sleep, but also to help people stay asleep. I think the technology is just beginning to scratch the surface on how we can have the first real technological solution for sleep I'm hoping more inventors will join me in a quest to help people sleep better, because we can help a lot of people in the process. I am clear that the device is not a magic solution or cure for the condition. I find that I am able to share important things from my own research, but mostly from dealing with Jessica and watching how she deals with narcolepsy in her own life.
Honestly, it has changed my life. I went from barely functioning and being really sick all the time, and I'm about to graduate from college now. So it has made a huge difference.
I get my greatest motivation from thinking about how I can help people live better lives. I can't tell you what a great feeling that is for me as a dad to know that I've done something to help my daughter.
So, oh, thanks. So, my time is up, right? Is it? What's that? It's at what time am I supposed to go to?
Questions, would that be good?
I can keep talking.
I know,
I think you didn't know that.
trust me, I know that. But I think, how many of y'all would like to ask some questions? I think everybody's like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, everybody says let him talk?
As you're thinking about your questions, I will tell you that
What time is it?
WebMD just called me out of the blue and they said, we would like to send a film crew to your house. And it was their idea that I do the thing with my garage door opening and crossing my arms. I forgot that was in there. I felt a little embarrassed. But I will just end that by saying the first thing that I'm collaborating with IHMC researchers on is adapting this technology for our special forces soldiers who have a very hard time. All right, I'm ready for a question.
All right. Okay, where are we going? Okay.
How do we
Go ahead, just talk right in.
how do we get a headband?
Well, let's see. For the fourth lecture, I would like to come back for.
Yeah.
About running a small business in America. Actually, I had a company that was making and producing those things. But with the advent of COVID, it was right at the time I was in discussions with a consortium of companies to acquire it. But I ran out of runway of investment, so I decided to turn it more into a research effort right now than a commercial product. So nowhere right now, unfortunately, but I hope to change that.
We got this young man right here.
So I actually had a few questions. One, I was surprised that. Oh, sorry. Why was there not why, but more just, can we relate anything more of sleep to the sorry, I speak in a very high register at a soft voice. I'm sorry, but can we attribute the lack of sleep to the gaining of nutrition during, because more people sleep right after they have dinner, which is obvious, but with nutrition, our body gains energy, and when we sleep, our body is just restoring most of that energy most of the time. So when we gain that energy from having a meal, does our body resist the ability to sleep?
Of course, we eat to get energy and other things, calories, but we don't want just empty calories. To get that energy to run all the systems of our body, and the question is just how does that affect sleep? And as far as our identified mechanism of the brain contraction during deep sleep for that cleaning purpose, that's pretty much independent of that energy intake. So our bodies are going to demand sleep even if you happen to be well fed, and the feeling of sleepiness we often get after a meal, that comes more toward just our body working hard to digest food, and that, of course, is going to have a feeling on us. But since we are on that subject, I have thought maybe together we can do this, start a brand new diet. As a student, you can remember feeling exhausted after taking a long test like the SAT, and you just feel exhausted. Well, maybe that's because your brain is using all that energy. So how about think your way thin? And it's just, you can sit around thinking about whatever, eat food even. And no, I don't think that would work, but I'm sure we could sell it. But
Dr. Larson, thank you very much for coming. I want to tell you a quick story. When I was in the Air Force, I had a roommate who had narcolepsy. And I fixed him up with a young lady from UCLA, and we double dated. Okay. And we went back to our apartment, and we separated. I went in the kitchen, and he went in the living room. I suddenly heard a scream from this woman, and I ran in and I said, "What's wrong?" I was kissing him, and he fell asleep. And that's a true story.
Yes. Well, and I will say that is how it works with this cataplexy, which is a loss of muscle tone, does come on these people whenever there is an emotional stimulus, which could be something frightening or something very pleasurable or something funny.
Yeah.
So narcoleptics tend to want to live a life that is pretty well neutral if they can.
The question I have is, all of us see NREM 1, 2, and 3. Right. Where can we go to find out for our own bodies what it looks like on a screen and when it occurred? Because, you know, I have no clue if I'm in NREM 1, 2, 3, right, when I am, but I think it might be interesting to know, is there some kind of apparatus or some way you could, as a home, you could get a device that would help you?
Right. Well, and in the headband, I actually have a version of this, which is a very small box that adhesively sticks to your forehead, and then you can use wireless earbuds to get the specialized tones that have the effect of brain entrainment. And I'm saying things that are actually in my presentation, but I never could find out when I was supposed to end. And so brain entrainment at the heart of this sleep technology is actually getting your brain to have waves that are in sync with an external stimulus. And instead of it being a swinging pocket watch, you know, you're getting sleepy, that might cause your brain to slow down. We have these special tones that actually enlist the aid of part of your brainstem called the medial superior olive to create a periodic stimulus. So it's the brain affecting the brain itself, which makes it more powerful. And we've observed this with patients in functional MRI machines where we look at active parts of the brain when people are listening to these tones. So we are sure that we are activating parts of the brain that relate to sleep onset and maintenance. So as your question about where you can do this at home, the newest version of this device, I can transmit brain waves to your wireless device, your phone. The interesting thing about this is it's nice for illustrative purposes to talk about the different brainwave categories representing different parts of sleep, but it's just the case that all the time your brain has some activity that is operating across the whole spectrum of wave speeds. The important thing to track is the shift in the energy. So when you're wide awake, listening to something fascinating, you know, like right now, is that too much? Your brain is primarily humming along at about 40 to 60 hertz. So 40 to 60 times every second, brain waves are going across your cortex. And you pick that up as a trace of voltage changes that have lumps at about 40 or 60 humps each second. As you begin to slow that brainwave activity, you get into the range of about 20 hertz, and that's when you're on the threshold, getting close to, you know, getting a little sleepy. This is when you're very meditative, in the zone, thinking clearly, maybe. Some people find that. In fact, I did some work with the Colorado Rockies where they wanted to entrain baseball players' brains to about 20 hertz when they're in the batting cage because they're able to focus on the ball more. But when you get to 10 hertz, that's that moment where somebody will say, "Psst, wake up." And you say, "I wasn't sleeping." And then you realize, or was I? I don't know. When you get down in the range of about 7 or 8 hertz, that's middle sleep. Deepest sleep is all the way down to 1 hertz, where 1 time a second these brain waves are washing there. And it's the relative amount of energy in each one of these that changes to slower rates. So if you just saw the raw data on your phone, it wouldn't really mean much to you because it has lots of variations. But what we do is just a mathematical technique called a Fourier transform, for those of you who remember calculus, where we take things in the real-time domain and put it in a frequency domain, and that elucidates, shows us which frequencies are active, and we look at the changes over time to see that someone is moving to sleep. So soon you'll be able to get an app that'll do that. Yes?
Dr. Larson, I'd like to address interrupted sleep in the aging body. And a lot of times you wake up, it's usually a pit stop, and the mind won't stop. And I have found that if I do I think it's a biofeedback, deep breathing exercises, is it because concentrating on that deep breathing slows the brain down from thinking about other things?
Sure.
Or does it actually help a person fall back to sleep?
Right. Well, as I am learning more and more about the placebo effect, the more I'm convinced that it is important that we believe that something is the case. So every time I'm presented with a question about is this the reason or that the reason, I always want to be careful how I answer. So it sounds like I'm hedging here. But yes, I believe you are right that if you're breathing rhythmically, you can induce your own brain to slow to match that. So that is your own way of dealing with it. And so I'll never say that can't be it, because if it works for you, then that's fantastic. And if someone else doesn't believe it, I hope they just keep it to themselves, like I'm trying. Unfortunately, the pit stop that you're having often involves needing to go to the bathroom when you're older, right, in the middle of the night. These are the things we should talk about more often, because when I got older, I felt like, why didn't somebody warn me about these things? And once we're awake, it can be difficult for our brains to go back to sleep. And so it's unfortunate that there are these other events that will prompt awakening, and then it makes it difficult to get back to sleeping, in part because you've already got some sleep. When we look at the various cycles that someone has when they're asleep, like Lori, when she hits the bed, because she's like, got a little sleep debt, the first cycle when her brain slows down to deep sleep will come on her between 90 and 110 minutes after she falls asleep, and it will last for the longest period of any deep sleep during the night, because her body knows, ooh, we're getting it now, let's get as much as we can. Then suddenly her brain will start to speed up, and just when it looks like her brain is headed toward those wavelengths that correspond to being awake, she enters a special state of sleep called REM sleep. And some people confuse REM sleep with that deep sleep stage. REM stands for rapid eye movement, and that's when someone's asleep. You look at their eyelids, you can see that their eyes are flashing back and forth underneath their eyelids. This is when we do most of our dreaming. And so when Lori begins to seemingly wake up, her brain adopts on a brainwave EEG trace. It looks like she might be awake. There's a little extra of 7 to 12 hertz activity compared to her actual awake, but it's hard to tell the difference. That's because her brain is active. And an interesting thing happens that I've already alluded to. Her body will experience an involuntary paralysis of all her voluntary muscles that presumably prevents her from acting out the things that she's dreaming about. And there is an awful sleep disorder where that mechanism goes haywire on people, and they actually do try to act out their dreams because their body starts moving and thinking about acting out the things that it's thinking about. And then her brain will slow back down, and if she is a healthy sleeper, getting enough sleep, she will have 4 or 5 of these cycles during the night until finally she will wake up after the last one. And I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but if it does happen, try to remain calm. But sometimes in the morning, people will achieve consciousness before that paralysis goes away. And it's a terrifying experience, I'm told, to wake up and not be able to move. And in fact, you don't even have voluntary control over that respiration part, and you feel like you should be breathing fast because you're afraid, but you're not. And it can feel like something heavy is weighing on your chest. Typically only lasts under a minute, but they tell me it's the longest 50 seconds that anybody has to go through. It is most common to teenage males. Teenage boys have this experience more than anyone else. In fact, a few years ago, I saw there was a horror movie based on this, and it's common through all cultures. And in fact, in Spanish, the phrase for it actually literally translates to "dead man on my chest," because it's frightening. Yeah.
Okay, well, on that note, y'all, I'm sorry we have to, but I know Michael would probably welcome any questions or anything. If you all want to get in touch with Michael, I have his information. Sure. And you can get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to share that to continue your conversation with him. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our last lecture on May 30th. Thank you. Have a great night.